Hello, friends. This is Gabriel. Many of you will know Tom Holland, the author, who is famous for his podcast with Dominic Sandbrook, The Rest is History, which I highly recommend, and his many books, including most recently Pax. But he's also written on Christianity and the Bible in Dominion and about Islam as well. In this episode, we discuss his earlier work on Islam, his interaction with famous Quranic studies scholars, including Patricia Crone, Fred Donner, and others, and his more recent work on the Bible, Dominion, and how that engages with a larger argument about the Christian revolution. This is a great episode. I'm so happy you're here. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Watch to the end. And please just take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. Thank you very much. Hello, Tom Holland. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, it's an honor. I'm a big fan of your writing, your work, your podcast. The Rest is History. I'll mention some of those things in the introduction. So yeah, it's just terrific to have you with me on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. Well, I look forward to speaking about both the Quran and the Bible. We'll focus on your book Dominion, but speak a little bit about Islam and the Quran as well. So does that sound okay?
That sounds good.
Okay, great. Yes, so friends, here's a brief introduction. Tom Holland, as you may already know, co-hosts a really hit podcast called The Rest is History, which everyone should be subscribing to. He does that with Dominic Sandbrook. He's the author of many books, including Rubicon, The Triumph and the Tragedy of the Roman Republic, which won a big prize, the Hessel-Tiltman Prize for History. He's the author of Persian Fire, Millennium, The End of the World and the Forging of Christendom, and intriguingly, for viewers of Exploring the Quran and the Bible, a book, In the Shadow of the Sword, about the early Islamic conquests, the origins of Islam. He's done all sorts of documentaries, as you may know already, for BBC, BBC4, and others on subjects ranging from ISIS or Daesh to dinosaurs. Among these was Islam, the Untold Story. That was interesting experience probably for you in the UK doing that one, Tom?
Yes, it was. So that was basically off the back of In the Shadow of the Sword, which took, I guess you'd call it a revisionist take. I'm sure all your listeners will, I don't need to explain what that is. So it was slightly skeptical towards the received Muslim narratives about the life of the Prophet himself, about the origins of the Quran, about the beginnings of Islam. And I met commissioning editor of Channel 4, which is a broadcasting company here in Britain. And he asked me what I was writing about, and I told him and laughed and said, well, never in a million years would you commission a program on that. And he kind of took up the challenge, and he did end up commissioning a program about it. And I got paired with an absolutely brilliant director called Kevin Sim, who's very, very distinguished director, going right the way back. The earliest film he made was about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and he went and spoke to some of the soldiers who had taken part in that for the first time. And since then, he's done a whole, brilliant array of documentaries. So it was a great honor to work with him. And he brought his own distinctive perspective, sensibility to the project. And it was quite a labor of love, because you can imagine that once we'd done all the filming, the process of getting it into a condition that people at Channel 4 felt was ready to go out was quite arduous.
Right.
So I remember it as being probably the most grueling film that I made.
And the filming was, you were in Istanbul, I think in Jordan, in Wadi Rum or something. You traveled quite a bit in Jerusalem.
Jordan and the Sinai, we went to St. Catherine's as well.
Okay.
So, but Jordan basically stood in for everywhere else in the Near East. There's a finite amount of money, so you simply can't go everywhere.
Right.
But we went to Jerusalem, and we got to get inside the Dome of the Rock, which was an incredible experience. I hadn't thought that would be possible. So that, and we went to see various sites, various locations. We went to Hebron to see the tomb of Abraham. So it was a brilliant experience.
You see the Israeli soldiers outside
that's right, yeah,
the shrine, which is both a synagogue and a mosque. It's really well done. I show it to my students. I know there was some controversy afterwards, and it was going to be publicly filmed, and maybe that was canceled. And so I don't know if you want to get into that.
So what happened was it went out on Channel 4, and Channel 4 couldn't decide whether they were, because Channel 4 was founded to be the kind of anti-BBC. It was meant to be doing kind of edgy things that kind of pushed the boundaries, all that kind of stuff. And it had slightly strayed from that opening mission. And I think they felt with this film, they felt kind of, ooh, you know, this is quite edgy, quite exciting. It kind of took them back to their teenage years, that kind of thing. But at the same time, they were very, very nervous about what the reaction might be. And so they kind of went for compromise where they said Tom Holland goes in search of the prophet, you know, that kind of level. So understandably, lots of Muslims across the UK who very rarely get to see programs about Islam or watched it and were absolutely appalled by what I was saying. And so there was a pretty vituperative response from a minority of people who'd watched it.
Right.
To the extent that I had an officer from Special Branch attached to me, and there was going to be a public screening of the film to journalists and parliamentarians that had to be cancelled because of death threats. What I was thinking of. But it was all very. It was. I think in the long run, it was all very overblown. So it was horrible being in the eye of that particular storm, but it's long since blown past.
I mean, it's really well done. I show it to my students here at Notre Dame. And in addition to, I mean, scenes from the Middle East, Istanbul, Jerusalem, and elsewhere, you also interview the superstars of the world of early Islamic studies, people like Fred Donner and just brilliantly the late Patricia Crone. There's some great moments with her.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay, so I'll just carry on. I've almost made it to the end of the introduction. I got distracted there. Most recently, friends, well, not most recently, more recently, in 2019, Tom published this book, Dominion, which we'll be speaking about, which is subtitled How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And then most recently, and just released in the US, is this book.
Just come out.
PAX, I think just a couple of weeks ago, was released in the US, maybe earlier in the UK. Do you want to say a word or two about PAX?
Yeah, so I the first work of history that you mentioned, actually, Rubicon, was a history of the fall of the Roman Republic. So that's the age of Julius Caesar. And then I wrote another book about Augustus and his dynasty. And this book takes the story on from the death of Nero up to the death of Hadrian. But I should say that they are all of those three books are designed to be self-contained. You don't need to read them in sequence.
Right. Okay, great. Well, we won't be speaking about Rome, although it is a temptation of mine to do so, particularly PAX, which has received all sorts of buzz around it. But let's speak first about In the Shadow of the Sword, just a few questions. And we're going to speak about the Bible and how the Bible reshaped civilization and continues to do so, even when you don't notice it, because the world seems de-Christianized, but is it really? So we'll speak about all of that, but I can't help but ask about In the Shadow of the Sword. I mean, how did you get into that project? Because people might associate Tom Holland with Rome, with dinosaurs, with antiquity.
Well, probably Persia, more with Rome than dinosaurs.
Not with Islam. How did you get interested in Islam? And
well, the first book, as I said, was
sorry.
Yeah, not cricket. The first book that featured Caesar and his world, and then the second book I wrote, which was about the Persian Wars, so Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis. Writing both of them, trying to get inside the heads of the Romans, the Greeks. I felt a kind of dawning sense of just how alien they were, just how strange they were, and the assumptions that had governed a lot of my, right the way from childhood when I'd first started reading about them, that they weren't that different to us, that in so many ways Greece and Rome were the seedbed from which the Western civilization emerged. I increasingly came to doubt that. And I came to think, I mean, not originally, but it is, I mean, it's not a perspective that is universally taken at the moment. But I came to think that what really changed was the coming Christianity, and that the incubating of Christianity within the Roman Empire was really what was most significant about the entire sweep of Roman history.
Okay.
And I wanted to stress test that thesis by looking at the moment that I kind of think is where a distinctively Western form of Christianity emerges, and therefore, basically the West emerges,
Yes.
which I came to identify with the 10th and 11th centuries, so the period around the year 1000.
Mm-hmm.
And as the kind of the build up to that, I looked at the collapse of Roman power and the emergence of the barbarian kingdoms and how they they became Christian, and the way in which a lot of the rubble of the collapsed empire in the West was reused and recycled, and the degree to which the stamp, the memory, the aftershocks of the Roman period endured right the way, for centuries and centuries. And I remember looking particularly at the Theodoric's buildings in Ravenna.
Okay.
And thinking how you mentioned dinosaurs, how they were kind of like the Archaeopteryx, the midway point between theropod dinosaurs and birds, kind of, evolutionary midway point. And then I looking at that and thinking about that, obviously came to think about the Dome of the Rock, which similarly has that slight Archaeopteryx quality, it seemed to me. That the dome was, of course, very Roman architectural feature, that it has mosaics, that it's on a site that was politically, culturally, religiously sensitive in the Roman period. And to wondering, well, to what extent were the early years of the Arab Empire, did the Arab rulers of this empire have a similar relationship to Rome and to Persia as, I don't know, the Franks or the Goths in the West had to Rome? And that was the question I wanted to ask myself. And it was probably a foolish project to have undertaken. Firstly, because I didn't really have the languages. I didn't have Arabic. And secondly, because, of course, I realized very rapidly that this was a question that opened up all kinds of very, very sensitive questions. Mm-hmm. And I found myself in the middle of what was effectively, I think in some ways, possibly the most stimulating academic debate in the whole field of historiography anywhere. Right. Certainly it was in the early 2010s when I embarked on it.
Yes.
And nobody had really written about it from a non-academic perspective for a non-academic audience. Mm-hmm. So the process of deciding how to write it, there was a kind of two-layer thing. I had to decide what I thought, right. It's kind of absolutely immersive process of immersing myself in very, very dense, complicated literature, and then deciding how I was going to frame it for the general reader. So right. It was by miles the most challenging book I've written.
So the image you give of the Dome of the Rock and the larger question of the emergence of Islam with the backdrop of empire, both Byzantine, Roman, and Persian, or more generally the question of late antiquity and Islam's emergence. I mean, that is still the question for people who work on early Islam. It continues to be. There was a major book by a scholar named Aziz Al-Azmi entitled The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity, which takes a very distinctive anti-revisionist approach, quite rigorous book. I mean, it's not just apologetics, very, very serious academic book. In fact, people complain that its writing is too complicated to be understood by most people. But that was prescient, that insight about thinking through Islam with a backdrop of empire and late antiquity. It continues to be debated here at Notre Dame. I teach a seminar on Islamic origins. I have a visiting scholar now who's come from Turkey to study the Quran in late antiquity, sitting in the seminar, and this is sort of an issue which transcends Western scholarship. Increasingly in Islamic countries, there's interest in this. I did want to ask.
I
Yeah.
mean, because it was the Quran that obviously I came to realize stood at the heart of the
Right.
question, because I am not a Muslim, so I don't think it came from God. So therefore, if I'm writing, and I think that this is a discipline that a popular writer perhaps has to face up to more rigorously than an academic writer. I've read loads and loads of academic accounts, studies of early Islam that do not overtly grapple with the horns of this particular bull. If you do not think the Quran comes from God, then you have to explain where it comes from, and that requires you providing an alternative explanation. And I think that it's a text of human origin, and therefore you have to say, well, what might the human origins have
Well,
been?
most people
And obviously, it's
avoid the question,
incredibly
Tom.
obviously, it's
Exactly.
incredibly difficult, because the only account we have of how the Quran comes into being is the Muslim one.
Is the religious
So
Islam. Right.
you're kind of groping around in a dark room.
Well, most people, they simply will attribute agency to the Quran itself. The Quran says this, the Quran says that, or maybe speak obtusely about the Quran's author says this or that. I mean, I'm guilty
Yes,
of
but
that.
what do
I
they
do
mean
that.
by that?
Exactly.
It's very, and the thing is, I think that if you are a scholar talking to scholars, everyone is so familiar with the context that perhaps that is all read. But if you are writing for a general audience who know nothing about it, and you're saying, actually, the Quran didn't come from an angel, didn't come from God, your reader is going to want you to explain, well, okay, where did it come from then?
Right. Well, I've noted that scholars who enter into Quranic studies or early Islamic studies from other fields oftentimes remark that this field looks different. Islamic studies looks different. People speak in different ways. They're more careful. They don't ask the same questions. For example, I don't want to, as my kids would say, throw shade on this particular book because it's very useful, but the Study Quran, published by HarperCollins, is more or less a constructive theological project. Extremely useful, has lots of resources. It's a compendium of Islamic commentary, but it doesn't look like the Study Bible, also published by HarperCollins, at all. I don't know if that resonates with you, that you sort of
Very
enter
much
into
so.
a different
Very much
landscape,
so.
different conversation.
Yeah, very much so, because I wasn't immersed in biblical scholarship, but I knew enough about it to know that there'd been a kind of almost 2-century process of scholars crawling over the biblical text, like gnawing away at it, devouring any sense of it being a whole, and systematically saying, well, where did this come? When was it written? How was it written? What might the authors have been? What's the history of its transmission? When was it canonized? All these kind of questions. And none of this seemed to really be a feature of the study of the Quran. And one of the reasons why I found Patricia Crone, who you mentioned, so helpful, was that she did seem to be asking these questions and in some way providing answers, as did Fred Donner as well, who was also in the film.
Yes.
So he, I think it's the collection of essays that you edited on the Quran in late antiquity, and he opens with a brilliant essay where he says that some of the most fundamental questions that every other person who writes about an ancient text takes for granted, we have no answer to them. Who wrote it? Where was it written? When was it canonized? Even what language was it written in? That these remain subjects of furious debate. So it was, as an outsider and a non-specialist, it was a very, very grueling project to attempt.
I would also add just a quick coda maybe to this conversation, and then I have one more question about the project on Islam. But there is a very intriguing trend in early Islamic studies, Quranic studies, where increasingly a younger generation of scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim, but above all Muslim. I mean, most younger scholars in the West in this field are Muslims, some religious, some not religious, but at least coming from a Muslim context. They are engaging more and more with late antiquity and biblical tradition. Obviously, when it comes to thinking about the Quran, it's not just the Bible, it's all the Jewish and Christian texts. And I would very humbly add that exploring the Quran and the Bible is a good example of that sort of work. So there's lots of younger scholars. So I'm
But you
slightly
see, you hadn't
optimistic.
written that when I when I did mine. I wish you had.
Yes. So okay, one last question. I just do. Is there an anecdote or two? I mean, you meant for the Channel 4 documentary, you mentioned we both mentioned Patricia Crone and Fred Donner. You also interviewed Guy Strumza, the Israeli/French scholar, but also more traditional Muslim scholars. I think both Sayyid Hussein Nasser and Muhammad of George Washington University in the U.S., Iranian, and Muhammad Abdul Halim of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London feature. I think they're both in there. So was there any one moment that, I don't know, that you would call to mind that was sort of particularly memorable?
It was definitely meeting Patricia Crone at Princeton.
Okay.
We interviewed her in her house, and we kind of filmed her gardening and all that kind of thing. And she had wanted to go to Princeton's best tasting restaurant the evening before. So we were very happy to do that. So I went and I had an entire evening with her. And I could ask her anything. Yes. And it was it was incredibly exciting for me, to meet this, I think, of all the many, many scholars to whom I have debts for all the many books that I've written, I think that she is the bravest and most brilliant scholar that I've ever met.
I have a quick Patricia Crone anecdote, which maybe doesn't do justice with the profundity of your last reflection, but I highly suspect she was the external reviewer for when I submitted my dissertation manuscript as a book, for different reasons, which I won't go into. But at one point, she's correcting, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 things on every page of a pretty long manuscript, and her comments are not always very gentle. And at one point, she's Danish, of course, not a native English speaker. At one point, she wrote in the margin, "Does this person even know English?" So that was a humbling moment.
Well, so of course, I mean, part of the reason why it was such a wonderful evening was that I was terrified of her. I mean, I didn't know of her reputation.
Yes.
And brilliance, I think, is terrifying. I mean, she was not a woman to suffer fools gladly. So I felt,
that's for sure,
quite nervous going out for dinner with her and then interviewing her.
Yes.
But she was actually lovely. She was lovely with us. She was such fun.
Very, very kind person. Would be surprised. I mean, her pen was sharp when she was criticizing competing scholars, but in person, I agree. Yeah. I'm going to awkwardly transition to this book again, to Dominion, published by Basic Books, I think, in 2019. Everyone should have a copy of it. So we're turning now from Quran and Islamic studies to the Bible. I would be very sort of, I don't know, probably clumsy if I tried to summarize briefly the argument, but it's about the subtitle does it, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Probably I should stick to that. In an early chapter, you have an anecdote of the Roman general Pompey entering into the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. If it's okay, I'd just like to read this passage and then ask you to comment. So you write, this is about Pompey. In the event, he found only emptiness. There was no statue in the chamber, no image of any kind, just a bare block of stone. Yet Pompey, although bemused, left not unimpressed by what he had seen. He refrained from stripping the temple of its treasures. He ordered its custodians to scrub the complex clean of the marks of battle and permitted them to perform the daily sacrifices. He appointed a new high priest. Then, freighted with prisoners, he departed Jerusalem, bound for a hero's welcome back in Rome. So why speak about this moment in particular, the entering of the pagan Roman general into the Jerusalem temple?
Well, so the way the book is structured, it's not even 2,000 years, it's 2,500 years. And the thesis of the book is essentially that we are so saturated in the West with Christian assumptions that we don't even notice it. Mm-hmm. The Christian revolution has succeeded so totally that we're not even really aware of the scale of the revolution that has taken place. And that's why I go back well beyond the birth of Christ. because to argue that everything changes, I have to show what exactly has changed. And so the way I structured the book was to impose symbolic numerology. So the two, 3 is a key Christian number, and 7, of course, is a key Christian number. So I have 3 parts, each divided into 7 chapters. Each chapter is divided into 3 parts. And each chapter opens with a kind of historical vignette. And the passage that you are reading comes from the second chapter, which is looking at the Jews and the roots of Christianity in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, and the experience of the Jews under the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. And I open with the capture of Jerusalem by Pompey the Great, who will go on, of course, to become the great rival of Julius Caesar.
Right.
And I think it catches a moment that is freighted with symbolic significance, because of course everyone knows that the Romans worship multiple gods and that these gods were portrayed in physical form, and everyone knows that the Jews worshipped the one God, and
Yes.
the graven images of this God were not permitted.
Yes.
And so it is always assumed that there was therefore an inherent and ultimately irresolvable tension between the Romans and the Jews. But actually, it's much, much more complicated and interesting than that, I think, because Pompey shows great respect to the Jewish God. And as why would he not? Because a Roman as successful as Pompey knows that success depends on keeping the gods on board, essentially. A religio, what goes on to provide the base word for religion. A religio for a Roman is a bond that joins you to the gods. You have to, so maybe offering a sacrifice or showing respect to a god in some way. So that's what he's doing. Pompey is establishing a religio to the Jewish God. So I think there is nothing inevitable about Romans and Jews going to war. And in fact, I've come to the conclusion that the word Jew, when used in English in the context of the early centuries of the relationship between Romans and what I prefer to call Judeans, is very wrong, because Jew in English comes freighted with so many significations that are anachronistic in the ancient context, that in Pax, where I describe the Judean rebellion against the Romans that culminates in the sack of Jerusalem, and of course the destruction of the temple, and then the other Judean rebellion against Hadrian that culminates in the very destruction of the word Judea and its replacement by the word Palestine.
This is the Bar Kokhba, the second. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. I think that if you use Judean, you make them seem less exceptional, because the Judeans are a people like any other people that have links to a motherland, that have a metropolis in the form of Jerusalem, and have distinctive cults. And of course, the Romans find the Judean cult weird. I mean, it is weird to have no statues in the temple, to only worship one God. But then pretty much everyone the Romans meet are weird. I mean, at least the Judeans don't kind of castrate themselves and dress up as women like the Syrians do, or worship gods with animal heads like the Egyptians do, or sacrifice people in bogs and oaken glades like the Britons do. The Romans take for granted that they are the people with the best religiones, the best links to the gods, because the proof of that is that they rule the world. But they are more than respectful of the fact that other people worship different gods in different ways, and they're prepared, basically, so long as those people don't rebel, to live and let live.
So maybe there's an aspect of overplaying the cruelty of Roman dominion in over Judea, over the Jews, or no?
I mean, by our standards, the Romans are very, very brutal.
Okay.
Very brutal. They exercise an absolute monopoly of violence. That is what enables them to uphold the Pax Romana. But everybody's brutal. I mean, it's not like the Gauls or anybody else, a kind of mellow beatniks. They're not. Everyone is brutal, and the Romans are just more effective in their brutality. I think what queers the pitch for us, and this is one of the things that I explore throughout the book, is the fact that what for the Romans serves as an emblem of their power, their right to torture to death slaves who refuse to accept their servitude, of which the cross becomes the emblematic punishment.
Mm-hmm.
The cross for us symbolizes a very different form of power. For us, it symbolizes the power of the tortured over the torturer, and the victim over the victimizer, and the slave over the master. And that complicates our relationship with the concept of imperial power mm-hmm. in a way that relationship was not complicated really for the Romans.
I mean, that's a theme that runs right through the book, the idea that Christianity brings this attention to the weak, the poor, the outcast, and inculcates among its community a sense of obligation towards them. I mean, I think, is that a fair? I mean,
yes.
Because you have a later chapter towards the end of the book on, well, it starts with World War I and turns to Hitler in World War II and all sorts of things about that. But that same theme is very prominent there. That the Übermensch has no patience with this Christian compassion or solidarity with the poor.
Yeah, but because of course the philosopher who
the poor and the weak
dwells on this is Nietzsche, who notoriously calls Christianity a slave religion, mm-hmm. And he has this great parable, and he's kind of telling it's a parable. It suggests that even Nietzsche hasn't really emancipated himself from Christian influence, but he tells a parable in which a man comes into a marketplace and says to everyone, how are you doing what you're doing? Haven't you heard that God is dead? We've killed God. But he also says that God is in the corpse of God is in a cave, and the shadows are cast by the flittering. So he's kind of reworking Plato's
allegory of the cave
metaphor, I guess. And that sense that we live amid the shadows cast by the corpse of God, I think is a very strong and powerful one. And the fact that Nietzsche predicts that the death of God will result in terrifying cataclysmic upheaval is proven very, very quickly after Nietzsche's death.
Yes.
Most obviously the emergence of fascism, and specifically Nazism.
Yes.
Because Nazism, in a way, is the most revolutionary ideology that the West has experienced since the coming of Christianity itself. Because unlike the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, both of which do target institutional Christianity, but they celebrate and enshrine basic Christian presumptions, namely that the last shall be first, the idea that there is a dignity in being the oppressed, and also that there is a universal human identity. I mean, that's the kind of the founding conceit of the French Revolution.
Yes.
Is that it's being done on behalf of universal human rights.
Yes.
And likewise, the Russian Revolution, Marx has a global vision of where communism, of the role of communism. But Nazism repudiates both those fundamental Christian principles. It says that the weak should absolutely be crushed, and it absolutely rejects the idea that there is no Jew or Greek, because it very much feels that Jews are distinct from Greeks.
Yeah. I've fast forwarded, and I'm gonna have to find a way to bring us back to the Romans. But just on this point, while we're here on this chapter, that's just a brilliant chapter. It integrates Tolkien as well later in the book. I forget which number in the 3x7 format it is, but it's in the last section.
19, I think.
Entitled the
Chapter
Psalm,
19.
maybe for the reference to 1916 and World War I. Yeah. So, I mean, there's no Jew or Greek. I think you mentioned that as obviously the words of Paul, but quoted by one of the popes, maybe Pius XI. I may be getting that wrong, and I'm a Catholic, so that's bad. but in response to the rise of Nazism. But then you use images, I think, coming from Hitler himself, of speaking of a tree that needs to be pruned, or a soil that's been infested, that needs to be purified. Right, they're, very powerful and terrifying images.
Well, the Nazis are obsessed with metaphors that derive from biology.
Okay.
So whether that is the idea of germs, bacilli that need to be disposed of, or whether it's kind of cod Darwinism, the idea that it's survival of the fittest, that those who fail in the race of life are doomed to vanish and should vanish. And that, the key thing to remember with the Nazis is that they don't think they're evil. I mean, we kind of have because for us, they have become, I think, the protagonists in a mythology that has replaced the Christian mythology. Hitler plays the role of Satan. The Nazis are the devils. Auschwitz is hell. I mean, this is the mythology that haunts us. But we think that Hitler is evil for Christian reasons, because he offends the Christian principles that we have inherited. That's why he's considered evil. But of course, Hitler didn't think he was evil. Hitler thought that he was doing what nature required of him, and indeed what destiny required of him. That the Aryans share a common blood, and that they're in a war of survival with peoples with other blood, and that it's his duty as leader of the Aryans to secure their future. That this is the right thing to do.
By the way, everyone, there's a four-part series on the rise of the Nazis, and the rest is history, which is brilliant, just incredible. Starting, in the late 19th century and carrying on through to the dawn of, or the very edge of, World War II. I don't know how to do this exactly, but I do want to ask more about Rome. So you have a chapter. I'll just awkwardly transition back. So you have a later chapter from the one that deals with Pompey, that deals with Julian the Apostate. So famously related to Constantine, grandson? Nephew. Okay. Nephew of Constantine. Thank you. Who raised a Christian, who famously adopts paganism. And you just have a couple of nice turns of phrase here about the state in the mid to late 4th century of paganism in the Roman world. You say the strut of the ancient gods had become cringe. That's very good. And then you speak also about this dynamic that we were discussing, even in the context of the Nazis, which is, the Christian message of care for the weak and poor offended Julian. You write, quote, "The heroes of the Iliad, favorites of the gods, golden and predatory, had scorned the weak and the downtrodden. So too, for all the honor that Julian paid them, had philosophers." How's the dynamic different? We spoke about the terror of the racial vision of the Nazis. The Romans, it wasn't about race, I don't think, but it was still about power for them. And Christianity and the gospel message was an obstacle and a bother for them.
Well, Constantine, of course, is a great conqueror, and he rules the Roman world, and the Roman Empire will, of course, become Christian.
Yes.
So there is, you might think there's a tension there. There isn't, because Christianity, like Islam, is a compound of paradoxes that, in a way, I think both of them are kind of civilizational ways of understanding the world. And the world is so complex that you can't have that without multitudes of paradoxes and tensions and ambivalences.
But what about Julian in particular? Can I just jump in and ask about Julian? What went on with his psychology?
So I think Julian embodies a lot of the tensions that actually shadow the first centuries of Christian Rome, because Julian regrets the abandonment of what he sees as the glory, the gold, the glamour of the ancient gods and the ancient heroes. But at the same time, he cannot help but bear the stamp of the Christian upbringing that he has had and repudiated. Because when he goes to, say, the shrine of Apollo or of Cybele, and he finds them kind of run down and abandoned and very few people there, he lavishes the priests with money to so that the priests can kind of get their mojo back. But he tells them, what you've got to do is provide alms and charity to pilgrims and to the poor. This is what you should be doing. This is what the gods have always wanted. But that's rubbish. I mean, the gods never, they hadn't wanted this at all. It's what the Christian God wants. So Julian is actually very Christianized. And his feeling that, in a way, he is perhaps the most Christian of all the emperors in his sensibilities, in his morals, in his values of the 4th century. Because the other Christian, the overtly Christian emperors don't seem unduly worried about things that clearly worry Julian. I mean, they very happily feel that, I'm sure this is why Constantine is able so easily to adopt Christ as his God. You know, he's looking for a unitary divine patron that can adequately mirror his own unitary power on the face of the earth. So he's identifying with Christ as a conqueror, as a winner, you know, with this sign conquer, the famous vision that appears to him before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge.
Yes.
And that sense that Christianity, by signing up to Christianity, the empire is signing up to a God who is a winner, who is more powerful than any other god. I mean, this is really, really important.
If it's okay, I'll just explain the reference to the Milvian Bridge. So you'll know it better than I do, but Constantine has a vision of a cross, and I usually hear it in Latin, although presumably for him it would have been in Greek. It says, "In hoc signo vinces," by this sign you will conquer. He's fighting his rival, I think it's Maxentius. And I mean, the sign that he sees in the sky is not "Blessed are the meek" or something like that. It's conquest.
Well, it's both, isn't it? Because it's a cross.
Okay.
I mean, this is the one of the very profound paradoxes in Christian history, that the cross, which had been used by the Romans as an emblem of their power over slaves. So rebellious provincials would counter slaves because they've taken on the rank of slaves by submitting to Roman power. So that's why Jesus suffers the death of a slave. With Christianity, this becomes an emblem of Christ's triumph over the empire, over the apparatus that had put him to death. And so having this at the heart of their faith over the course of the centuries, Christian leaders, Christian emperors, kings, whoever, have to recognize that wars of conquest have become more complicated, that, you know, their savior suffered death at the hands of an empire. So that is something that they cannot entirely escape. But of course, over the long run through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the cross becomes an emblem that gets carried to the far corners of the world.
Yes.
It gets carried to Mexico. It gets carried to Africa. It gets carried in the long run to Australia, and planted there, and becomes an emblem of Western power.
Yes.
So the cross is at once an emblem of the radical recognition that in weakness and defeat, there is a source of power, that being at the bottom of a pile can give you privilege, that there is privilege in a lack of privilege. But at the same time, it's the emblem of the West. And that generates all kinds of tensions.
Yes.
All kinds of paradoxes that we live through right now.
Yes. Yes.
Right now.
You've done some great episodes on Columbus, and I mean, he has very complicated religious dimension to his life, but he was deeply religious, I think, fair to say, and saw his journey to what he thought was somewhere in Asia to be part of a larger struggle for Christendom. And yeah, just one example, I guess. Okay, so then Islam emerges by the traditional dates. The Prophet Muhammad is born in Mecca in AD 570. He begins preaching in 610, dies in 632. The conquests begin almost immediately, really towards the end of his life. There are some battles at the edge of the Byzantine Empire, and within 100 years, Islam conquers, as you know, and you've written about it in The Shadow of the Sword. It conquers an empire that, is to the Indus River in the east and to the south of France in the west. I think Poitiers, the Battle of Poitiers, is 732, so nicely 100 years after Muhammad's death. Was the success of Islam as an empire because of the failure of the Byzantine Rome and its marriage of Roman power and Christianity?
I think that that what becomes Islam is a result of two things, to simplify massively. The first is an absolute cascade effect of calamities that overwhelms both the Roman and the Persian worlds, of which plague, I think it is, I mean, even since I wrote it, I think the evidence for the plague having been the Justinianic plague, the plague that breaks out in the mid-6th century, having had a devastating impact, has grown and grown. And that plague would disproportionately have affected settled and urban areas. So freakishly, perhaps for the first time since the emergence of civilization in Mesopotamia, the balance of population, and therefore the balance of power between the Fertile Crescent and the regions bordering the Fertile Crescent are kind of less pronounced than they might otherwise have been.
Yes, yes.
And then on top of that, you have this terrible war in the first decades of the 7th century between Rome and Persia, between Constantinople and Persia, and it leaves the traditional centers of civilization, so from the Mediterranean through to Iran, absolutely devastated. It's kind of like the aftermath of the Second World War. And throughout this period, both the Persians and the Romans have been employing Arab troops as mercenaries along their borders. And you'll read in history books after the Romans defeat the Persians, they reoccupy, they take back Palestine and Syria. But what does that mean? I mean, who are the Romans? What are we talking about when we talk about the Romans? I mean, lots of them are Arab soldiers, and Arab soldiers can fight. There are different factions. So I think that in many ways, the conquest of Palestine and Syria and Iraq is kind of collateral damage, perhaps, in faction fighting between different bodies of Arabs, all of whom have different relationships to their Roman and Persian paymasters.
Yes,
some are thinking,
of course,
we will profit from our imperial masters. Others, we will feed on them. But the other factor, of course, is the sectarian milieu, as it's called, the fact that you have Jewish and Christians, you have heretics who are Jewish and Christian adjacent. You also have Zoroastrianism, of course, in the Persian world, and this provides sanction for conquest and for people who want to see themselves as the chosen ones of God. And when in due course, the richest provinces of the Roman and Persian empires kind of fall into the lap of various Arab war bands, how are you going to explain it? I mean, something as extraordinary as this can only be explicable in terms of God giving it to you.
Divine sanction. Yes.
Divine sanction, because there's no other way of explaining it. And I think that these are the circumstances that enable this extraordinary process of conquest to happen, and for the ideology to emerge, justifying it and explaining it that over the course of the century and a half that follows will become Islam as we recognize it now. That's my feeling. That's my take.
It really is fascinating to read the classical sources speaking about the conquest, which, as you probably know, are called the Futuhat classically, the opening of the world for Islam in Arabic, and concern in contemporary writings to interpret them as, well, not really wars of conquest, and there are different reasons why they took place, but ultimately it was for the good of different societies, or they were defensive in some way. But this is just not the vibe of the medieval Islamic chronicles. I mean, God was with us. God blessed the earliest Muslims because they were faithful to him.
But every enduring empire has to persuade those who've been conquered in the long run that it's for their own good. The Romans had done this.
Mm-hmm.
This is why when I talk about the Romans, I'm actually talking about people who live in Greece and Anatolia and Byzantium, who are calling themselves Romaoi in Greek because they've come so utterly to identify with the name of their original conquerors that they are now Roman after Rome itself has fallen.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, over the course of the Arab Empire, as it shades into the Islamic Caliphate, the genius is to persuade the conquered that it's been for their own profit. And of course, it's not one way, because what ultimately happens is that Islam, as we would recognize it now, is largely a creation of the conquered. It's people's turning the words of the Quran back on their conquerors and fashioning a much more inclusive civilization than the purely kind of ethnocentric empire that the original Arab conquerors had formed.
I think there's something to be said for that. One could shine light on the development of, let's say, that the metropolitan context of Baghdad and the massive translation movement of works principally from Greek, also from Syriac, in the participation of Jews and Christians who were subjects of the Islamic Caliphate in that. But something else I think is also worth noting is that, I mean, Islam appears and doesn't disappear, doesn't retreat. I mean, the Umayyad Caliphate falls away, and eventually the Abbasid Caliphate loses its power, and the Mongols come in and things. But even when the Mongols come in and conquer Baghdad in 1258, they become Muslims. So there is a certain I don't know, enduring power of Islam on a social level.
Well, I think Islam is the most successful imperial ideology of all time. The Romans are long gone.
We don't have much time, so yes. Yeah. I'm going to turn back again awkwardly. Someone should teach me how to do these things more elegantly. But back to a later bit of the book. So, and we've already jumped back and forth because we started with the Jews in Pompey, and then moved up. Somehow we got to the Nazis, back to Julian early Islam. But there's a chapter towards the end of the book where you speak about someone named Edward Cope. So again, the larger theme of the book is thinking about, as the subtitle says, how the Christian Revolution remade the world, and the way in which even when society becomes ostensibly de-Christianized, it's really not. And in this chapter, you engage basically, I think it's entitled Science. You engage with Darwin and Darwinism and evolution, but also Darwinism in a larger sense of that word. But could you just say a word about Edward Cope? How did you find out about him? Why were you interested in him? And why?
So Edward Drinker Cope is a Quaker who from Philadelphia, who becomes one of the most distinguished paleontologists in the 1870s and 1880s in America, at a time when the lead in the study of paleontology, extinct creatures, dinosaurs, and so on, is passing from Britain to America, because it turns out that in the west of America, the fossil fields there are of an unrivaled richness. And Cope starts going out west at the same time as his great rival, a figure called Charles Othniel Marsh, who is based in Yale, is also going out. And it's the most notorious rivalry in the history of paleontology, because they're taking kind of rival gangs of cowboys and people to find bones, and if they, you know, if they can't take the bones back, they'll smash them up rather than allow his rival to get them. And they're riding, you know, Cope is riding into the Badlands of Montana at the same time as the Sioux war bands in the wake of the Battle of Little Bighorn are roaming the land. So it's an incredible story, But Cope is interesting, I think, because he is a very devout Quaker who does lose his faith ultimately over as a result of Darwinism. And having said that, you know, I guess my argument could be parodied as everything is Christian. I think Darwinism isn't. I think Darwinism is the great shock to the kind of to Christian assumptions. And Cope is honest enough in the long run to recognize this and to be thrown into despair by it.
Can I read something that you write in Dominion about Darwinism generally? Yeah, so I'll just go ahead with this passage, which speaks about this very point. So you write, nervousness at the idea that humanity might have evolved from another species was not bred merely of a snobbery towards monkeys. Something much more was at stake. To believe that God had become man and suffered the death of a slave was to believe that there might be strength and weakness, victory and defeat. Darwin's theory, more radically than anything that previously had emerged from Christian civilization, challenged that assumption. Weakness was nothing to be valued.
Yeah. And of course, we know where that's going to lead. But I think that what is interesting is the you know, Nietzsche recognized this. I mean, he acknowledged it. He was honest in his atheism. I think a lot of celebrity atheists today are reluctant, even if they may be evolutionary biologists themselves,
yes,
are reluctant to acknowledge the moral implications of this. The idea and yes. the idea that you just get rid of Christianity and all will be light is itself very Christian, because what they are doing is essentially kind of hyper Protestantism. It's the idea that reaches back through the Reformation, ultimately all the way to the Hebrew prophets, that if you overthrow idols and banish superstition and chase away the dimension of the supernatural from, you know, from hills and groves or whatever, then the people who walk in darkness are brought into light. And that has obviously been an absolutely dynamic part of Protestantism. And I think that the idea that all you have to do is banish, not as the Protestant reformers did, the dimension of superstition from popery, but banish the kind of mad superstitious ideas from the dimension of the rational.
Yes.
And all will be well, all will be great. You know, we will have perfect, we'll have perfect enlightenment, is itself unbelievably Christian. Because why would you assume that? Why would you assume that the default mode is to care for the weak, or to, you know, kind of universal identification with all of humanity? I mean, that humanism is purely Christian. It makes no sense without Christianity.
Do you think that Darwin himself was as convinced he was of the science?
I think
of
so.
His findings? Was he
Yes,
was he
so.
troubled by the potential moral consequences of them?
Well, he came from a very strong anti-slavery tradition, and one of the you know, famously one of the things he found in nature that dissuaded him from the idea that there was an all good, all powerful God was the wasp, the Neumann wasp, yes. that lays its eggs in living caterpillars. He couldn't comprehend how.
Imagine the caterpillar was what touched his conscience.
Yeah, but the problem is that having his Christian faith having been dissolved by that, he then, I think, finds himself in a moral world where what argument would you make against slavery? Why shouldn't the strong abuse the weak? I mean, what argument is there against it? And he never really overtly engages with those kind of questions, but he does throughout his life suffer from all kinds of complaints, stomach upsets and bad dreams. And
Okay.
I mean, who knows? I don't want to do cod psychology, but I wonder whether the implications of his own theory did shadow him more perhaps than he was prepared to acknowledge, because he is very reluctant to go out there and fight like Achilles on the the battlefield of opinion, unlike the guy who is called his bulldog, Thomas Huxley, who is very keen to get out there and fight the good fight, but who is recognized both by his contemporaries and by he himself as a very, very Puritan figure. He overtly compares himself to a Puritan, combating bishops and so on. I mean, he recognizes where he stands culturally in the line of inheritance, and I think he enjoys that in a way that Puritan divines kind of smashing stained glass windows or toppling icons of the Virgin or whatever would. I mean, he feels that that's exactly what he's doing,
right?
But because he's part of that world. Whereas I think now in the 21st century, so many atheists fail to recognize their line of descent from Christianity, and therefore essentially culturally how Christian they are. There are very few atheists like Nietzsche who are prepared to say, well, in a world without God, the strong can do as they will, and who's to say that they're wrong to do that?
Yes. Well, I find it convincing. I'd also just encourage everyone to read also the whole book, but don't take for granted how interesting the end of the book on the contemporary playing out or unfolding of the argument is in different dimensions. You have a chapter that begins with the Beatles, and let it be. I thought you were going to speak about George Harrison and Hinduism, but you take it in.
Well, I did. I wanted to. I didn't have space, but I'm hopefully saving that for another book. Okay.
Yeah. So great chapter in that is integrated with some reflections on the evangelical vision of George W. Bush and the Iraq invasion, and how he ostensibly at least saw himself on a mission for human rights, and everyone they'll all be grateful when we liberate them in Iraq and that sort of thing. Okay, thank you, Tom. That was great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you. And before we go, can you just give us a brief word or two on what you're working on now and what people should look forward to from Tom Holland?
Well, you mentioned my book Pax on the heyday of the Roman Empire. That's just come out in the United States, and I've been doing a lot of publicity for that. I'm also working hard on the podcast. We're about to go on a tour of Australia and New Zealand with that. And actually, we're midway through recording 4 episodes on the Golden Age of Baghdad. So we'll be recording the last 2 tomorrow, and those will be out mid-October.
Great. Well, we'll put all of the links in the description, and
thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much.